In the second part of today's session, I will discuss the main actors of the foreign direct investment that I discussed so far. And these main actors are transnational corporations, or TNCs, or as you might say, capital without borders, or at least almost without borders. In many textbooks or lectures, you will hear very sharp distinctions and definitions of transnational, international, multilateral, and global corporations. And I'm very glad that our textbook doesn't do this, because these distinctions sound very, very reasonable and as if you were able to categorize the world. But in the end, I don't think they say very much about the world. So I'm glad that our textbook sticks with only using the one word TNC, or transnational corporation. They define transnational corporation as a firm that owns and controls production, value-added facilities in two or more countries. I will just briefly explain the term value-added facilities here, which is basically the same thing as production facilities, but I mentioned the term value added one or two times before in this lecture. Now I want to explain it. The idea is that the product that you have at the end of the production process and that you and me as consumers might buy, they have a certain value. So a certain telephone might cost 600 euros if you buy it in the store. And then you can ask, so where does this 600 euro value come from? And where does this money go? Then you first have to subtract, in Germany, 19% as value-added taxes. So then you're roughly at 500 euros. Then some of it will go to the shop where you bought the telephone, and so on and so on. And in the end, maybe you still have 300 euros left as the value of this phone. And then you can ask, well, in what production steps does what part of this value emerge? So how much emerges from a miner mining for a certain mineral in a country under the observation of some militia or so, and what part is the people who just assemble the smartphone in the final production steps, and what about the part of the process where the screens are created, and so on and so on. So you can ask this question for all the components of the smartphone, and in each of these different steps, from gaining the raw materials to the final assembly and then putting it into the packaging, you can say that in each of these steps there will be some value added to the final product. And then you can say, okay, in what step what amount of value has been added. And it's not always that easy to really calculate this, but at least you can try to do so. So you have the idea that in each step of the production process, some value will be added. And a transnational corporation is a corporation where this production process is happening in more than one country. So this can either mean that they are, for example, building the car parts in one country and then assemble the car in another country. It can also mean that they produce cars in two different countries without any parts crossing the border, but at least there has to be some production and in at least two countries, which also means that if we have a company that will have the production in one country only and then sell these products to other countries and may only have some offices in these other countries in order to coordinate the process of selling these products, then it's not yet a transnational company, but a national corporation with some sales networks around the world maybe. However, production has to be in at least two countries, and typically if we talk about big transnational corporations, those are way more than just two countries. What this also means is that basically if you have a corporation and this corporation engages in meaningful foreign direct investment, then you will typically automatically have a transnational corporation, and this is not a perfect equality between the two sides of the sign, but at least almost in general you can say a corporation that does FDI then becomes a transnational corporation if it's meaningful. So what does this mean? What does the existence of these TNCs mean for our view on the relation between politics and business, so for our view on political economy? First, we can say, well, we have this very idealized view of political economy in one country. There we have the nation state, which is here represented as this kind of fish tank, and this fish tank stands for, of course, the national borders, so this is one container, and this also stands for the legal framework that the government and the state create, and this legal framework determines what kind of practices businesses can engage in. And in this legal framework, then businesses will do their business, and then they will produce stuff and distribute stuff and create wealth. And this is one idealized way to look at the political economy in one country. But you already see that one of these business fish is already lurking outside the fish tank. Short side note, please note that I used fish tanks and not a fish bowl, because bowls are not good for the fish living in there, so don't use fish bowls. Then you can develop this further, and then you say, okay, the fish that was only lurking out of its fish tank in the last picture, now it's not only lurking out there anymore, but it's really also going into other fish tank. And there might be some problem with water and air here, but let's not talk about this. Now we have this very big fish that exists in addition to the small fish that are just moving within one tank. And these very big fish, they are not only moving from one tank to another, they are so big that they have different parts in different tanks, yet all of them still have their bases and their origin in one country. So this is their country of origin or their home country, but they also move some parts into other countries, which are the host countries. And as you see, the picture changes a lot by this, and it does not only change in the sense that the metaphor does not work anymore here. So it changes the relation between politics and TNCs. So this means, first of all, that TNCs move beyond the legal framework of the single nation states or of nation states in general, and now can pick and choose between them. And so it's not sufficient anymore to have one nation state making regulations on how businesses can act. If the businesses act in more than one nation state and can move between them, then they are not contained by these legal frameworks anymore. However, we must be careful not to make this a story about vile, evil corporations working beyond the state and against the states. Typically, states support their own TNC. So the states of the countries where the TNCs originated from, they are typically cooperating with their TNCs. One example for this is if you look at the attempts of France to regulate big internet corporations such as Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and so on, by demanding them to pay taxes for the revenues that they gained in this country. So if Facebook makes money from Facebook ads that are displayed to customers in France and earns such and such billions of dollars for that, then the French state says, well, pay taxes for this right here, right now. And something similar goes for Google and Amazon and so on. And so the French government made this law to make sure of this. And then the American government pushed back on that because they said, well, these French, they are trying to inflict harm on our corporations, despite these corporations having the origin in the United States, but not really being only US American, but being transnational already, but there is still this connection. So many corporations can count on their home state to support them when they have trouble abroad. However, we must also see, and this is also visible in this picture here, that some of the TNCs are bigger than some of the states. And this does not only mean that the very big corporations are bigger than, I don't know, a very small city-state somewhere without many people living there, but also some corporations have a higher income than the GDP of small but relevant countries, and of course even much bigger than the government revenue of these countries. And because these TNCs are so big, their investments will also be relevant in comparison to the GDP of a certain country. So the countries and the governments of these countries have an incentive to engage in policies that will attract TNCs to their country, which means lowering taxes maybe, or making some deregulations, or doing individual deals with companies and saying, well, if you build these facilities here, then you don't have to pay taxes for the next 10 or 20 years or so. So this is something that governments engage in, and this can be beneficial for them, because even if the companies themselves don't pay taxes, the employees that these companies will have in the countries, they might pay taxes, so the government might win. However, this means that the governments compete for the favorability of the TNCs. So this is what sometimes called as a race to the bottom, because if every country tries to offer even lower taxes than the next country, then in the end TNCs won't have to pay many taxes, which many TNCs actually don't really do at the moment. And this means then also that TNCs can play government out against one another, and that they can always evade those legal frameworks that they deem unfavorable to them. And finally, them being so big also means, and I'm going to explain this a little bit more later, that they themselves become actors in global governance. So it's no longer the case that we have a state that makes a political and legal framework independent of the businesses, that the businesses have to abide by, but rather that the businesses themselves are very important actors in creating this very framework. However, if we take a non-idealized view of national politics, we also already see this on the national level long before there were TNCs. If we look at the development of TNCs historically, then we first see a leading role of US American TNCs that expanded around the world in the middle of the 20th century, also to Western Europe, where they had new markets. And then after the 1960s and the 70s and 80s, also European and Japanese TNCs emerged and also accessed the American markets, but also competed with American TNCs in many other markets, not only in their home markets. And now in the last couple of years, we also have an increasing role of foreign direct investment and of TNCs from emerging markets, and above all, of course, from the so-called BRICS countries. So that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And of these BRICS countries, most importantly, of Chinese TNCs. And in general, we can also say that all those transnational corporations become ever more transnational. Now, what does this mean? What you see to the right are two diagrams of the Transnationality Index of the biggest TNCs in the world. This index is a composite score, which is the weighted average of 3 scores. So you ask 3 questions about the companies. A, what share of the total sales of this company is foreign sales? So how much of their product is sold in other countries than the home country? Second, how much of the assets of these companies are in foreign countries and not their home countries? So the value of the factories in the different countries. And third, you ask the number of employees in the home country vis-a-vis other countries. And of course, the larger the share of these 3 variables in the other countries is, the higher the Transnationality Index will be. And what you see here is that the transnationality of the companies varies for companies from different home countries. However, what you also must see there, that we have Switzerland as the country with the most transnational TNCs, and the United States as one of the countries where TNCs are less transnational. However, this of course also refers to the fact that Switzerland is a very small country and the United States are a very big country. So the market of the United States is much bigger. So it means less for a Swiss company to be more transnational than it would mean for a US American company. However, what you definitely see here is that these biggest TNCs in the world became more transnational over the course of these 20 years, while they all, or most of them, are way beyond 90% transnational, and the average in 12 is still 67%. So 1/3 of their business activities are still in their home country. So they are transnational, but they are not without a place in the world as it is sometimes portrayed. So they still have strong connections to their home country and their home economy. Finally, we have to look at them, as I already said before, as political actors. What does this mean? So first, you can argue that the emergence of TNCs also led to the emergence of a new class. So the classic, put in a very crude way, the classic Marxist class analysis says we have the working class and we have the capitalist class, so those who own production, means of production, and those who have to engage in wage labor. If we look closer at Marx's work, we'll see that he already distinguishes more than these 2 main classes, but we have these classes. And now with the TNCs being such an important factor in global production, many authors argue that there is such a thing as the transnational or global managerial class and the transnational capitalist class. This is something that Robert Cox, for example, argues, so that the main managers of these companies, they are also quite transnational. So you have American TNCs whose CEO might be Indian or from another country. So it's not anymore the case that the TNCs are led always by someone who comes from their country, but there has emerged an international class of managers that go to certain business schools and that are socialized in this corporate world, that then form this transnational class. And this class also has its class interest that must not be the same as that of capitalists in businesses that are still dominantly national. And so they also have their way of expressing their class interest politically. And one of the ways is certain association and forms of TNCs that they use to communicate with one another, but also to communicate with politicians and with world leaders from the political sphere, and also where they can make their interest heard. The most famous of these forums is probably the World Economic Forum, which has its center in Davos in Switzerland, or which has its main gathering in Davos in Switzerland. And this is a forum where you often see pictures also of the leaders of states that are at this forum, but they are only there as guests that are highly welcome. They are not members of the World Economic Forum, because members are only the biggest corporations and the biggest companies in the world, and they come together and discuss what they find important in economics these days, and they are happy if political world leaders also come to the forum, because then they can have interaction with them, which is also good for the world leaders, because it's good for them to be in the loop when global business leaders communicate. And this is of course a place where politics do happen. Then these transnational corporations, they are of course also active in promoting those international investment agreements that I mentioned before, and they do not only promote their existence, they are also at the table if two countries negotiate over an IIA. So if, let's say, Germany and Angola negotiate over an IIA, then the German government will listen to the demands and wishes of German TNCs, because this is what this IIA is all about, to make a German investment in Angola more attractive. And this is of course something where you listen to the TNCs, so they have their say, which makes sense, but also of course it's not without risk, or it's also questionable to some degree. And these TNCs, they not only form their own non-governmental organizations, so the World Economic Forum of course is an NGO, they also wield influence on other institutions and organizations in global government, where they also have a say at the table. So those big fish that emerged from their fish tanks, they are not at par with the governments, but they are also part of this world where global governance is made as actors, and not only as those who will then receive the rules and live by the rules. Finally, I want to make some remarks on transnational production and investment in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. A couple of weeks ago, I showed you this picture, which shows the capital outflow from emerging markets in comparison to prior crises. So we have in the black, we have the capital outflow in the 2008-2009 financial crisis, and in red we have the outflow in the current COVID-19 pandemic, and we see that the outflow is much more drastic than it was back then. And here I have an update, which is not very good news, but it's at least the news that it has not become much worse there. So you see now it's basically the same diagram, but now the line for the current crisis is in black, and there you see that after it fell to about 80%, the decline and the outflow isn't as steep and as strong as it was before. And this picture is from the end of April, and then from April, and then at the end of April we saw some recovery, so some capital flowed back to the emerging markets. I don't have the same diagram here anymore because this is not free online, but this International Institute of Finance, they would want money for me to show you this diagram. I'm not, or even to access the diagram, I'm not paying that. But here you have this diagram which shows the daily inflows and outflows, and there you see that in the days in mid-May there is some net inflow already once again, so there is some investment flowing back to these emerging markets. And if you have more questions on how this works, you might want to revisit the question and answers part for session 1, where I made some more lengthy explanations about this picture. One last thing I want to add here that makes more sense today than it would have made then. All of these capital flows here, they are not foreign direct investment, they are foreign portfolio investment. And here you see more clearly what I meant before when I said that foreign portfolio investment is more volatile than foreign direct investment, because again, if you bought a car factory in China and now there's a global pandemic, there is no easy way for you to get rid of this car factory. However, if you bought bonds and stocks in other countries to an amount that is not so big that you control it, so that it's still foreign portfolio investment, then it might be quite easy to withdraw from these investments, and this is exactly what has been happening here. So in this sense, when it comes to these kinds of crises, it might be better for the host economy to have foreign direct investment, because then they give up some control, but they can be rather sure that the capital will stay with them if there is an acute crisis. If it's portfolio investment, the capital will just disappear. As I said, it's a shy animal, and then this will result in problem for the host economy. One other thing about the current pandemic, the textbook described this distinction between the Fordist mode of production and the Toyotist mode of production. And Fordism is this whole thing where you have mass production and mass consumption, and where you pay your workers so much money that they can even afford the products that they themselves produce. And this means that you have an economy of big scale. And Toyotism is not directly an opposite of Fordism, rather it's a way to develop this even further. And the main things about Toyotism is that you try to be even more effective in production, but also be very flexible in production. So you don't buy all the parts and the supplies that you need for production in great amounts and then keep them in your storage facilities so that you can produce ever further and have a lot of suppliers. Rather, you rely on a small number of very reliable suppliers that will deliver the supplies to you just when you need it to produce. So just a couple of hours before you want to assemble your car doors and your engines and so on will arrive at your plant. So this is what we call the just-in-time production, whereas having everything in stock so that you can produce in any kind of way, that's what we might call the just-in-case production. So just in case something goes wrong with the delivery, we still have everything here and we can produce for a very long time without new deliveries. Just in time means we don't have that, but therefore, but instead we are very flexible. So what I heard a couple of times in the last 2 months is that the pandemic demonstrated the dangers of this just-in-time production, because right now we see how vulnerable these supply chains are. So if, for example, a car factory in Germany relies on parts from northern Italy, and there's a shutdown in northern Italy and the car parts will not be produced, then the car factory in Germany cannot produce the cars it would produce otherwise. And if the car parts are from Hungary or Poland, and the border between Hungary and Germany is not shut down to goods, because it never was, but there are controls at the border, so that the lorries that transport, or the trucks that transport the car parts, have to wait there for 3 days, then your parts might be late. And if there's only one part late, then your assembly line doesn't work, because you don't want to produce cars without doors. So this crisis might have showed the vulnerability of just-in-time production, and therefore some authors argue that we might see a return to this just-in-case production where we have everything on stock and can produce even if the supply chains are cut off for a couple of hours, days, or even weeks. However, we can also argue the other way around, because what we see is not only that the supply chains for car parts have been cut off, we also see that the demand in cars was very, very low, because this kind of economic crisis is typically not the moment where everyone thinks, well, let's buy a new car, because if you don't know if you have a job next year, if you probably guess that you can't drive into a holiday by car this year anyway, so you might think, well, why should I get a new car right now? I'd rather keep my money. I don't know what's going to happen. If I have the money, I'm flexible, so I don't buy a car right now. And this is something that many people think and thought in the last weeks. So car sales are down. And now think of the scenario I described before. So if the car manufacturer had all the parts at hand to produce all those cars of the 2020 models that they plan to produce, they could easily produce them now, but then nobody would be willing to sell them. And so they have one storage facility full of car parts, and then they have another storage facility full of newly produced cars that nobody wants. And they all get older and don't get younger. So maybe in 2 years, when the car sales will be back up there, then maybe nobody wants the car from 2020, and they don't have anything that they would want to produce with the car parts from 2019. So you can also argue the other way around and say, well, this shows exactly the advantages of the just-in-time production over the just-in-case production. So I'm not sure which effect will be bigger here. So this is probably what many managers of TNCs are wondering right now, and I'm sure that they are much better in wondering about this than I am, how they should strategically position their companies, because probably none of them will say, well, let's be prepared for the next pandemic, because there hasn't been such a big pandemic for 100 years now. So it would probably not be the smartest way to direct your whole business strategy by thinking of the possibility of having a thing next year that happens roughly once in a century. So they probably think about all these things. Maybe one way would be to have more locally concentrated, just-in-time production processes, where certain things that come from far apart are stored, so certain raw materials, while other supplies are produced in proximity. But this is more speculation on my part here. So that's it for today. Remember, don't keep fish in fish bowls, and remember, there won't be a lecture next week. I'm looking forward to your questions this week, and I'm looking forward to seeing you back again in 2 weeks when we're going to discuss international finance. Goodbye and enjoy the break.